All right, very good. Well, welcome everyone. I know it's a beach week for several folks, so a small group, that's all right. This will be a highly math-focused group, so get your calculators out. We'll be dealing with some heavy math today.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Joe.
Hello.
Oh.
Did you bring your calculator?
Yeah, it's
Yes, on my phone.
Perfect.
Yeah.
If you want to sit up front, we have 2 seats available.
Oh, no, I'm not smart enough to sit up front during this class.
All right, we're in Daniel chapter 9, if I remember correctly. We're in Daniel chapter 9. It is confusing. You know, we skip a couple of weeks here, we skip a couple of weeks there, and then in the other class, we skip some other different weeks. It's like, okay, what group am I talking to, and what did we actually get to? Keeping up with it, it's gotten kind of tricky. Anyway, I think last time we did the first half of chapter 9.
Other class, hold on.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember giving permission for that.
Too bad. You're welcome to attend anytime.
Tell him about it. Come
Get that a lot.
You know I'm teaching a class in Smithfield, right?
I did not know, but not surprised.
We suspected.
Yeah, so I teach a class. I teach the same stuff to a group in Smithfield at the Spady's house.
Yeah.
Different notes, though, right?
Different notes. Same notes.
And they're your second best class.
In Cypress Creek
Yeah, so that's on Monday nights. So
at 6:30 in Cypress Creek at Terry and Rusty Spady's.
How's the game?
if you ever want to get it again, or you miss Sunday and you want to catch it, the problem is we're not always on the same week, so there's no telling what class you'll get to. Okay. Chapter 9. So let me just review because it's been a while. If you remember, the first half of chapter 9 is really a prayer by Daniel, particularly for the nation of Israel. It's an intercessory prayer. So let me just go over the points from that from the last time. First of all, that when we talk about intercessory prayer, it's always in response to the word. In other words, always in response to what God has said and coordinated with what God has said. It's focused on his will. And about trying to be in agreement with his will, characterized by fervency and intensity. It's captured in self-denial. It identifies with God's people. In other words, it's in context, right? It's not just about me and my stuff. It's in context of what God is trying to accomplish. It's focused on confession, strengthened by confession. This whole prayer that Daniel is praying is all about confession, about his sins and about the sins of the people. It's dependent upon God's character. He talks often about God's character. And then really the main thing is that it's focused on God's glory. I want us to start actually at verse 16. To just kind of remember the end of this prayer before we jump into this week. So let's start at 16. I just want to read that. It says, O Lord, according to your righteousness, I pray, let your anger and your fury be turned away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy mountain, because of our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem, and your people, our approach to those around us. So again, he's talking about your people, your city, about our sins, right? Let's skip over to 18. Says, oh my God, incline your ear and hear, open your eyes and see our desolations in the city which is called by your name. For we do not present our supplications before you because of our righteous deeds, but because of your great mercies. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and act. Do not delay. For your own sake, my God, and for your city and for your people are called by your name, right? So over and over, he's focused. It's on God. It's about him. It's about his name. It's about his city. It's about his people. Not because we are something special, but because you are something special. I also want you to remember that at the beginning of the chapter, down around verse 2, he refers back to Jeremiah. He refers back to the 70 years. He refers back to saying, hey, listen, God, it's been 70 years. You said we were going to be pulled away into Babylon for 70 years. It's now been 70 years. So as he ends this thing, he says, okay, God, I want you to act now. I want you to do what you said you were going to do for your name's sake, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of where we are in this, in chapter 9. So then we're going to get into verse 20 and following today. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's read verse 20. It says, "Now while I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God." So verse 20 is kind of a summary of everything he's done in verses 1 through 19, right? He's praying, he's confessing. It's about the sin of his people. It's about the holy mountain of God, right? So it kind of summarizes those points there in verse 20. And then 21, "Yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering." So first of all, he's having this prayer while he is still praying. Then the answer to his prayer comes, right? Then Gabriel shows up. Gabriel appears while he's in the midst of praying. So recognize also that prayer was part of Daniel's life always, right? This is not something special that he did. I mean, he got thrown in the lion's den because he was praying regularly, right? So this is part of who he was, is prayer. But again, his focus is on the holy mountain. The focus is on God's people. And it's because he had this life of prayer. He had this fervency in his prayer. He had this confession in his prayer, all the things that we talked about. Then God steps in and answers this prayer and responds to this prayer. So in verse 21, right, he says, this man Gabriel, he's referring back to Gabriel. You remember he appears to him back in chapter 8. Gabriel comes and helps him understand the vision. And now he talks about Gabriel again coming to visit him and actually provide the prophecy here in verses 24 through 27. But he flies swiftly and reached me about the time of the evening offering. So the evening offering, this would be the time again when he's doing his regular prayer time. So why does Gabriel have to fly swiftly, by the way?
Angel?
Because he's not omnipresent.
Yeah, he's not omnipresent, right? So he's not always around. He has to zoom down there to get to where Daniel is in order to actually meet with him and give him this response. It's just something I think we just don't have in the front of our heads, that the angels are not omnipresent. God is, but the angels are not. And so when they have to get there, they got to get on their horse and zoom down, figuratively. So he comes down. He reached me about the time of the evening offering. And then in verse 22, "And he informed me and talked with me and said, 'O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand.'" Now, Daniel, in verses 1 through 19, his prayer is about, God, I want you to do something. I want you to act. I want you to respond. It's been 70 years. I expect you to do something about it. And his answer comes in, I want you to give you the skill to understand. I want you to give you information. He didn't exactly answer Daniel's prayer in the way that he expected it to be answered, right? He wanted God to do something right now. And actually what happens is that Gabriel comes down and he explains to Daniel what's actually going on. He gives him the understanding of what God is doing rather than God actually acting right here. You'll see in a few minutes. So he gives him this amazing prophecy. He gives him something incredible, way beyond what he asked for, but he does not give him what he asked for. So it's just kind of an important point to the response that he has. And then in verse 24, verse 23, "At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision." So Daniel is praying, right? He's got this long prayer, 1 through 19, that he's praying and praying. And what's interesting here is that, Gabriel says, as soon as you began to pray, God sent me to give you the answer to your prayer. Even though you've been, going over your prayer over and over, confessing, God actually sent me to give you the answer to your prayer right at the beginning when you started. We're going to get into that a lot more when we get into chapter 10, God's response to prayer. But it's interesting here that God, he heard the prayer, he responded to the prayer, even though the timing wasn't exactly the way Daniel expected it, right? He still prayed, while God was already sending the answer. Gabriel was already on his way to provide him with the answer that God wanted to provide him. The other thing in this, notice that at the beginning of your supplication, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. That little phrase in the middle there, you are greatly beloved. So I got to ask this question. Why did God answer Daniel's prayer?
Because he loved him.
Because he prayed believing he would?
Yes and yes. So why did God love Daniel?
Because Daniel was in a committed relationship with God. It wasn't a short-term thing. This was Daniel's lifestyle.
Any other answers?
Doesn't he also?
He loves
I was
everybody.
just say, doesn't he also love everybody?
Daniel was obedient to him. He set himself apart.
I just want you to ponder a minute. Why does God love anyone? Right? Why does God love Daniel? I think Daniel, there's no question that Daniel has a special relationship with God. He has a long-term, ongoing relationship with God, and God loves him. And God, Daniel is obedient, right? He's obedient in his prayer life. He's obedient all through his life, as we've seen over and over and over again. So part of my question here is, does God love Daniel because he's obedient?
No, Daniel's obedient because he loves God.
Yeah, but why does God love him?
He loves unconditionally.
Because he wants to.
He created us.
Actually, that's the right answer, because he wants to, right? Because God decided to love Daniel. Because God decided to love Daniel is why he loves Daniel. Now, there is a connection between love and obedience. We see that in the New Testament over and over. It's shown through obedience, as one of you said there a minute ago. I don't want us to get stuck in it. Because he had this wonderful prayer, because he did this great confession, therefore God responded. No, God responded because he loved Daniel, because he had this ongoing relationship with Daniel, and that was shown out by Daniel, by his obedience, by his fervent prayer, etc., etc. So, all right. Just to make sure we hit that point, you didn't get confused along the line. All right, now we get into verses 24 through 27, which is the real crux of the lesson today. This is the prophecy that Gabriel gives to Daniel. So let's jump in. So first of all, let me just read verse 24. 70 weeks are determined for the people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So we're going to get to the 70 weeks in a minute. Let's skip over that for a minute. But he says, at the end of the 70 weeks, right? At the end of the 70 weeks, first of all, there's something that is determined, all right? So the 70 weeks are determined, and all these things that following it are determined. In other words, these are things that God has decided. God has predetermined that there is going to be the 70 weeks and that these things will be true at the end of that 70 weeks. God has made that as a decision. And notice that it says it's for your people and for your holy city. This is something that God has determined about the Jewish nation, right? About Israel, about his people, about his nation. These things are determined. Now, what are they? First of all, it says to finish that transgression. Having trouble with my voice this morning. To finish the transgression. In other words, to end sin. To finish sin. Sin will be over. At the end of the 70 weeks, sin is no more. Sin is no longer a part of reality. If you look at the next verse, it says to make an end of sins. Notice that that's plural, right? So the first one he says to finish the transgression or to finish sin, right? It's sin in general is ended, but then also sinning and sins are also ended at the end of the 70 weeks. God wipes out sin in general, and he wipes out sin specifically at the end of the 70 weeks. And then finally in this part, it says to make reconciliation for iniquity. He also is the payment for sins is also done at the end of the 70 weeks. So the atonement for sins, the reconciliation for sins, all of that has taken place. So sin is wiped out in general, and specifically atonement is made for sins. Sin is completely dealt with at the end of the 70 weeks. So that's the first thing the first major thing that he says here. Then the next verse says to make reconciliation. Oh, that's what I just read. To bring in everlasting righteousness, right? To bring in righteousness that's everlasting. Righteousness is, one of the commentaries said, righteousness for the ages. So in other words, at this point, at the end of the 70 weeks, everything is under God's righteousness. Everything is under God's standards. Everything now is righteous at the end of the 70 weeks. Next part, to seal up vision and prophecy. So there's this really means that there'll be no more vision, no more prophecy. It's the end of Revelation. At this point, God's speaking to us directly. There's no need for revelation and prophecy. There's no need for prophets. God is speaking to his select at this point directly. It also has the idea of God's mark or God's seal of approval, if you will. He seals it. Everything is he's approved of where everything is at the end of 70 weeks. This is the finish. This is the end. This is the final, and he puts a seal on it. And then finally, to anoint the most holy is really to anoint the holy of holies. So this is the kingdom temple, if you will, the temple in the millennial age. The millennial age that begins, as we've talked about before, in the 1,000 years, that goes on forever. So it's really to put the Holy of Holies in place at the end of the 70 years that will extend for all eternity. So he's just describing here the end of the age, the return of Christ and the setting up of the eternal kingdom, and he gives these descriptions of it. We've seen this before in Daniel. If you go back to chapter 2 for a minute, verse 44, we've seen this description. I can see pages turn for a change. That's nice. When I don't see pages turn, it's very conflicting for me. All right, 244. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And then also in Daniel chapter 7, verse 14, we see a similar statement. 1:14 says, then to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, and all the peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away. His kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. And then down to verse 27 in the same chapter, it says, that the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. So we go back to chapter 9. So what he's saying is at the end of this 70 weeks, then all of these things that he's talked about in chapter 2, chapter 7, talks about this kingdom that will come. This is when that kingdom will be put in place, is at the end of this 70 weeks. All right, so now it's time for the mathematics portion of our class. We got to try to understand this 70 weeks. All of the commentaries agree that the 70 weeks is the word weeks in here is actually the word 7. It actually says 77s. So it's translated as weeks, but it's really 77s. And all the commentaries agree that he's really talking about a week of years. So it's 70 times 7 years, right? So it's when he says 70 weeks, it's 77 years. Not 77, but 70 times 7 years, right? It's interesting if you go over to chapter 10 real quick, verse 2 and 3, where it says, in those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant food, no meat, nor wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Mine says full weeks or whole weeks. What he's really saying there is 3 weeks of days to actually differentiate between what he has said back here in chapter 9, where he's talking about weeks of years. In chapter 10, he's talking about a normal week, a week of days. So he kind of makes that clarity. So here in chapter 9, he is talking about a week of years. Now, the next question we've got to deal with is how long is a year? In the Old Testament, the year was not 365 days. I need you to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 7 to get some clarity on this. This is really kind of cool, actually. So go there, Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. All right, so Genesis 7:11 says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, by the way, Noah lived more than 600 years, right? In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So notice there that on the 17th day of the 2nd month, this occurred. Go over to Genesis chapter 8, verse 4. It says, then the ark rested on the 17th, on the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. So here we have the flood started in 7:11 on the 2nd month, 17th day of the month. It actually, the ark rested on the mountain on the 7th month, 17th day. All right, so how long is that period? Hello?
Which period?
From the 2nd month, 17th day, until the 7th month, the 17th day.
5 months.
5 months.
5 months. Good. See, you can do math. This is not so hard. That's 5 months. Good. Now go to Genesis chapter 7, verse 24. 7:24, it says the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So 150 days, and we have 5 months. So therefore, how many days are there in a month? 30 days. Good. See, this is not hard. So my point here is when they talk about months in the Old Testament, they're talking about 30-day months. So a year then is how long?
360.
360 days, right. So in the Bible, when it talks about a year in the Old Testament, they're talking about 360-day years. Now, what actually happened, they recognized that they got out of sync with the lunar calendar, and so they would just throw in an extra month every once in a while in order to sync back up with what was going on. They didn't get the whole leap year thing and all that stuff yet at this point in time. They just added a special month every so often so that they could sync the calendar back up again. But in general, when they're talking about years in the Old Testament, they're talking about 30-day month, 360-day years. All right. So now we have, let's go back. We got 70 weeks, which is how many years, by the way? 490 years of 360-day years, right? I'm not asking you to figure out how many days that is, but that's true. Now, so we need to figure out then is he's saying that it's going to take 70 years for this to happen. When does the 70 years start is the first question we have to ask. And that is actually answered in verse 25. So let's look at verse 25. It says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. So first of all, you'll notice that it says there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So what does 7 weeks and 62 weeks add up to?
69.
69 weeks, right? So he's saying for 69 weeks, which is how many years? 483 years.
Yeah, 4
times
You don't have to do all the math yourselves. All right, so 483 years. So he's saying that there's going to be some period of 7 weeks, there's going to be some period of 62 weeks, but in 69 weeks from this beginning point. Now the beginning point, notice it says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem. So he's saying from the command that was given to go and restore Jerusalem, there's going to be, from that point in time, then if you go forward 69 weeks, then we'll have something else that we're going to have to look at, and we'll look at that in a minute. Now, the question is, when was the command actually given to go and restore Jerusalem? There's actually 3 different commands that were given for the people to return to Jerusalem in the Old Testament. However, there's only one where it says, I want you to go and return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. And that actually occurs in Nehemiah. So I want you to go there to Nehemiah chapter 2. I can't find you, Nehemiah. I know it's in here.
It's after Chronicles.
Thanks. That's Nehemiah. All right, Nehemiah chapter 2. Yeah, we're just going to start right at the beginning of the chapter. All right, so Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. It says, it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Remember, Nehemiah served the king, and to be sad before him was not a good thing. Typically, the king could kill you if you came sad into his presence. And so for him to come sad in his presence, there had to be something going on. And so verse 2, therefore the king said to him, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? There is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid. He was afraid he was going to kill him. And I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city of the place of my father's tombs lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? And the king said to me, what do you request? And so I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So here we actually have where King Artaxerxes gives the command to Nehemiah to return and to rebuild the temple. If you go back to the first verse, you notice that it says, it came to pass the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, blah, 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 easy for me to say. All right, so if you figure out all the math, when Nisan is, when is the 20th year King Artaxerxes, the commentators have figured out that this is March the 14th, 445 BC. Yeah, March the 14th, 445 BC. So then all you have to do is take that, add 483 years, and you can see where it ends up. However, before we do that, you'll notice again back, let's go back to Daniel a minute. You notice that he says there shall be 7 weeks and there shall be 62 weeks. So first there's this 7-week period, which is 49 years, right? 7 times 7, 49 years. So he says first there's the 7-week period, and then there's the 62-week period. So what actually happens here historically is that in the year 396 BC, which is 49 years past 445, that is actually when the temple was rebuilt. They actually completed the city inside and outside at that point in time. So after the first 7 weeks, the city was rebuilt. And then we have the so then you got, so that's the first 7 weeks. Then we have another 62 weeks. So if we add those 7 weeks plus the 62 weeks, that comes out to be AD 33. Right? So what happens on AD 33? If you notice here, it says, until the Messiah, the Prince, right? To restore and build Jerusalem, until the Messiah, the Prince, there shall be 72 and 62 weeks. So until Messiah, the Prince, that's supposed to happen in AD 33. So what happened in AD 33?
Crucifixion.
Yes.
Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry.
Yeah, it's the triumphal entry that they're really referring to here. It's when he was recognized as Messiah. He was recognized as the Prince. Now the crucifixion also occurs in 33. Not pushing that away. We're going to come back to that. But the main thing they're focused on here is this is when he's recognized as a Messiah. The people all praise him. He enters into Jerusalem. That is actually the date that is connected with this prophecy. So first of all, just pause for a minute and be fascinated by that, right? That this prophecy is here, 70 times 7 weeks. And you add all the math together, and it comes out to exactly be the date that Jesus enters the temple in the triumphal entry. So it's pretty amazing stuff. All right, now we've got 62 weeks. We haven't quite gotten to 70 weeks yet, so let's keep going in verse 26. So it's verse 26, and it says, after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. So after the 62 weeks, what he's really saying is after the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, right? So he's essentially saying after the 69 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off. So this is he's talking about is the crucifixion, right? So after the 69 weeks, we have not only we have the triumphal entry, we also have the crucifixion. Both of those occurring in AD 33. Now, not for himself, right? Jesus doesn't get anything out of this. And then we have, it says that, right, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. So the real question we've got to deal with here is, who is this prince? This prince who is to come, who shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Any thoughts before I throw you out of thought?
The Antichrist.
Any other thoughts? So let's just jump in. So the Antichrist is one correct answer. And I think that you got to recognize here that if you go back to chapter 7, verse 8, just to remind you, we were talking here about the four beasts, and particularly in verse 8, we're talking about the horns and the little horn and all that stuff, right? Let me just read it to you again. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little horn coming up among them, before whom the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn, their eyes were like those of men, and speaking pompous words. So here we had a vision of the Antichrist as this little horn. We also talked about it, that it was a leader of the restored Rome, right? If you remember that. So you need to make that connection again back here in chapter 9. We talk about the Antichrist, and we've got to go back to Rome. So we say that this prince shall come, the prince who is to come, the people of the prince who is to come, right? People of the prince who is to come. So the prince who is to come is the Antichrist. The people of that prince who is to come are who?
Jews?
Take a guess. Go ahead.
Jews?
No. The people of the Antichrist, who is to come, is who?
Who aren't raptured.
I'm sorry?
Who aren't raptured, those who are left.
No. The people of the, remember now the little horn, the people of the Antichrist is
Rome.
Rome. The Romans, right? He's actually referring to the Romans here. The people of the prince who is to come. The people of the Antichrist is in the newfound Rome. So what actually happens is that Jerusalem gets destroyed, the temple gets destroyed by the Romans, right? That actually happens in AD 70. The Romans come in and destroy the temple and the city. So there's this preview of the actual destruction of the temple by the people of the Antichrist, the people of the prince who is to come, when the Romans actually destroy the city. Now, you may go, well, wait a minute, I'm confused on the timeline. So is this the 69 weeks? Is this the 70 weeks? That math doesn't add up here. So what are you talking about? What again is not understood is the gap, right? The gap between the Messiah's death and the coming of the Antichrist, right? We've got kind of the breakdown of the Roman kingdom of old and the Roman kingdom which will come with the Antichrist. That gap, which is the church age, right, is not understood in these scriptures. Is not clearly understood. So if you go to, I'm going to come back to this, but let's for a minute just go on to verse 27. It says, "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of the abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate." So in verse 27, who is he?
Antichrist.
Yeah, it's the Antichrist. It's the same prince of the people from verse 26. He confirms a covenant with many for 1 week. So as we've talked about before, the Antichrist, when he comes in in peace, comes in with trickery, comes in having everyone believing he's the one that's going to solve all their problems, right? He's going to solve the economic problems. He solves all the political problems. He solves all the legal problems. He solves all the economic problems. He solves everything, right? So he comes in, he makes covenants, particularly he makes covenants with Israel. They believe he's the one. He's the Messiah. They believe at this point in time. And he does this for 1 week. Again, 1 week being 7 years, right? He comes in, and in the middle of the week, which is 3.5 years, right? In the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to the sacrifice. So again, we've talked about this before. So this is the tribulation, and it becomes the great tribulation at 3.5 years, when all of a sudden he turns on Israel. He ends all the sacrifices and the offerings, and he brings those to an end. And the abominations that in the temple, all of that happens as described there in the rest of those verses. So again, this is not only a picture of Antiochus, who we've talked about earlier, right? But it's a picture definitely of the Antichrist in at the end time. So this is the next a little bit more detail on that on the tribulation. When we get into chapter 11, we're going to get even more detail on the tribulation. But this is kind of the first detail about the timing of it. So again, let's go back over the years again. You've got 70 years total before Christ's return, right? Before the millennial kingdom is set up. First, you got 69 years until Christ's death, until Christ's entry into the temple, and then Christ's death. Then you got this week of tribulation, but there's this break between the 69 years and the 1 week, and that is the church age. So let me just pause there. Does anybody have a question about that I can answer?
Hey, Rich, I've got a question about the note in my Bible. It's on verse 27, talking about he will confirm a covenant. It says, according to some, a reference to the Messiah, the anointed one, verse 26, instituting the new covenant and putting an end to the Old Testament sacrificial system. According to others, a reference to the Antichrist, blah, 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 which we kind of just described.
Yeah.
Any other perspective on that? Or, I mean, those two seem like they're completely different.
They're complete opposites. Yeah, they are. And so I did run into that in the commentaries that they, part of the question is when in verse 26 when it says the people of the prince who is to come, is that continuing to talk about the Messiah, or is it talking about this Antichrist? And all I go back to is the commentaries that I trust more, kind of lean to the side that was the Antichrist, just because of the desolation that he brings in there. It seems to go along with that better.
Yeah, and I don't think that jives, the saying that this is the Messiah jives with verse 26, because this is talking about the people of the ruler who will come to destroy the city and the sanctuary. That's not believers that were going to do that, right? That's Romans.
Well, you do remember, though, that during Antiochus' reigns, there were some of the priests who actually aligned themselves with Antiochus, right, and helped him defile the temple, right? So in that sense, you can understand it that way. So that's so I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm just it is understood in both ways. I just kind of lean towards I really think this is more about the Antichrist, because that's the focus of what he's talking about really in the whole section. Now I want to go back and in the minutes we have remaining and just say something about all this. I don't think God is so concerned about us figuring out all this math, right? And figuring out what exactly the day is and what exactly the time is. You remember in Matthew, let's just turn there a minute. Matthew 18:22. I just want you to show you this and just make another statement. Matthew 18:22. That begins in 21. Right, Matthew 18:21. Peter comes to Jesus and he said, "Lord, how often shall a brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times?" And Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. It's interesting that it's the same number that we've just looked at, right? But I think in this particular case, Jesus is not saying, listen, I want you to forgive him 491 times. And then on the 491th time, I want you to kick his butt, right? I don't think that's his point. He's trying to make a spiritual reference here, and to indicate that it's a length of time that you did not understand. It's beyond your capability. It's beyond. I want you to forgive him ultimately, right, forever, and in all things. And so I think when we get too literal with these years, and I know there are people who want to count every one of these minutes and years and days and weeks and all that stuff. I don't think that's what God's point was. I really think they're symbols of God's actions. One of the things that you'll remember is that one of the reasons for the Israelites to be put into Babylon was that they had ignored the Sabbath year, right? They ignored the Sabbath year, which was they had ignored it for 70 years. So again, 70 years of 7-year Sabbath is 490 years. So again, I think God is trying to make a point here. He's trying to say something spiritual about the amount of time that they were going to be spending in Babylon, not so much that it was some specific date. So I just don't want us to get overwrought on the times and the dates and all that and think, well, I think God messed up here. I think God is trying to make a point about something spiritual going on and the punishment that is being given for their disobedience, rather than saying it's going to be some specific time that you ought to be looking out for. Now, it's interesting that chapter 9 ends with the the desolation, but that's not actually the end of the story, right? The end of the story is not the desolation by the Antichrist. The end of the story is actually verse 24, which we read first. He's saying at the end of the 70 years, after all of the desolation, after all of the things that the Antichrist does, then these things happen, right? The finish of transgression, the end of sins, the reconciliation for iniquity, and everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. I think we need to remember, again, in the time frame, we've got, there's going to be this terrible tribulation, but at the end of that tribulation, then we have the millennial kingdom set up, and then we have for all eternity the reign of Christ. So it's a bad news, good news story, not a good news, bad news story. All right, I think we're out of time. Any other questions before we go? I know we did a lot of math. I apologize for that, but anything? All right, when we get into chapter 10, 11, and 12 is really the last vision, and it's a very, very interesting set of chapters that we're going to learn a lot about prayer. We're going to learn a lot about spiritual warfare. I think it's going to be interesting to kind of give us more. As we've gone through Daniel, each vision has given us more clarity and more clarity and more clarity on these end times. And when we get to verses 10, 11, 12, we'll get chapters 10, 11, 12, we'll get as much clarity as we can from the book of Daniel. So, all right, thank you all. Have a wonderful 4th of July. Don't blow up any fireworks in your hands and stuff like that. Talk to y'all next week.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
I was going to look at maybe July 12th as another opportunity to get together. So it's Friday. It's 2 weeks from this past Friday. So it's, next Friday.
We'll take a look at it and see. Sounds great. I really appreciate you doing this, CT.
Well, all right.
All right, talk to y'all later. Thanks, On.
Bye.
See you.